All right, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us in our third webinar for our Security Over Compliance series. Today, we are honored to have Jerry Miller, the founder and CEO of Cloudticity, presenting for us on automating HIPAA compliance in the cloud. So Jerry is a successful entrepreneur and healthcare fanatic. He started his first company in elementary school and started successfully selling technology in 1998. He has always marched to his own drummer and has produced a series of successful businesses in the past. So as the founder of Cloudticity, which was founded in 2011, Jerry exuberates his passion for helping healthcare organizations radically reshape healthcare by unlocking the full potential of the cloud. So thank you so much, Jerry, for joining us today and presenting to us on automating HIPAA compliance in the cloud. Just a few housekeeping measures before I turn everything over to you. So everybody is entering into the webinar on mute. There are a couple of ways that you can actually interact with Jerry and ask questions throughout the presentations. Number one is through the chat feature, and two, you can unmute yourself and ask a question as it comes to you, or as if Jerry asks questions. So with that, Jerry, I'm going to hand everything over to you.
Great, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. I am on vacation in lovely Calistoga, Napa Valley, California. So apologies in advance if my 7-year-old decides to participate in this webinar, but I'm sure if he does, he'll have something valuable to add. As Sarah said, my name is Jerry Miller. I'm the founder and CEO of Cloudticity. We, since 2011, have focused exclusively on helping healthcare organizations be successful leveraging cloud technologies. So today, we're going to talk about how to automate HIPAA compliance, specifically if you're deploying technology in the cloud. We're going to talk first about the need for compliance. It's always helpful, I find, to set the stage and talk about some of the underlying reasons that drive compliance. We're going to talk about how compliance frameworks can help drive compliance around specifying exactly what security measures need to take place. If you are in the cloud, as we focus on, we're going to talk about specific services that can be helpful. We'll talk about the value of automation, and then we'll wrap up and open for any questions. So let's first talk about some of the underlying conditions or business reasons that drive the need for compliance. Of course, we all know about HIPAA regulations or things like PCI regulations. The 3 Fs, FIPS, FERPA, and FISMA. We've got things like the Cloud Security Alliance or federal regulations around ITAR. You've got your ISOs, your SOCs, your international regulatory frameworks. You've got EU and GDPR. So around the globe, there are a number of legal frameworks and industry frameworks that require a focus on compliance. Even more important, though, are the business conditions or consequences of not focusing on compliance and security. So for example, in the year 2017, there were 477 reported HIPAA breaches. 110 million Americans were affected by those breaches, which means 1 out of every 3 in the country had their security and their privacy breached through HIPAA breaches in the year 2017 alone. 3 years later, that's even worse today. One of the main reasons is that health records are extremely valuable on the black market. You know, they contain a tremendous wealth of information about a person that lends itself toward things like identity theft. People are even using identity theft from health records to forge prescriptions, which is fueling the opioid crisis. So a health record on average sells for about $75 on the black market, as opposed to around $2 for a social security number or a credit card number. Year over year, we're seeing a 320% increase in cyber attacks against the healthcare industry. If you're a small or medium business, chances are 50% that you are going to be the victim of a cyber attack. And in the healthcare industry, that's even higher. And what's really important is that 2 out of 3 of those that are successfully breached will be out of business within a year. So the need for healthcare, for compliance and security in the healthcare industry is tremendous. Those are not dice that I would want to roll. The fact of the matter is, if you're a business in the healthcare industry, you're a target. And you need to focus on the defenses of that target through a strong security program, which lends itself toward compliance. Now, one of the key aspects about compliance is it's not a one and done thing. A lot of people think that you go through an audit, you fill out a checklist, you check all the boxes, and all of a sudden you're magically compliant. That's not the case. True compliance comes down to effective security measures, and security measures have to be continuous. So you need to put in place continuous monitoring capabilities where you're watching your systems on an ongoing basis and ensuring that they're up to date, that your security measures are up to date, and that you're constantly monitoring the perimeter for any nefarious activity coming from the outside. You need to make sure that you've got a set of checklists and reports that you're reviewing on a regular basis to ensure that your security measures are up to date and that you're minimizing the risk of an outside intrusion. You need to make sure that you've got strong processes in place to monitor on a continuous basis all of these systems as they continue to grow and evolve, and as the threat landscape continues to grow and evolve. You've got processes in place to deal with all of the potential security vulnerabilities and mitigate that risk to maintain compliance. So again, it's not a one and done thing, it's a continuous thing. The difficulty of that sometimes feels like pulling a rabbit out of a hat, but it's not magic. There's a standard way that you can address this and effectively mitigate security risk for your organization. And that is through the use of a compliance framework. So compliance is being compliant with either a regulation like HIPAA or an industry agreement like PCI, for example. Frameworks translate the compliance requirements into actual executable, measurable security measures. So on the screen here is an example from the High Trust framework, which is at Cloudticity is what we adhere to. But there are a number of compliance frameworks out there that let you map regulations to actionable steps, tangible things that you can do in your security landscape to achieve that compliance, but more importantly, to mitigate some of that business risk that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. One of the ways that we do this at Cloudticity is through the use of standardized services. We build pre-vetted, pre-designed, pre-hardened services, and those are the only things that are going to be deployable by our customers. So for example, because we're in the cloud, we have accounts that are where our clients' networks reside and their computing assets reside and their data reside. So we have standardized the way that accounts are configured. We standardize the way that accounts are used. We standardize the way that accounts, infrastructure, as well as software are all deployed. And then we standardize the set of supporting services that we use to monitor and maintain a secure security posture. Standardized account configuration means that when we deploy a new account for a client, it's always done in the exact same way. We use multiple availability zones, which allows us to divide where assets are deployed geographically, so that if there's a problem in one geography, traffic is automatically diverted to a second geography. We segregate things that should be accessible to the public from things that should only be accessible privately. We automate things like adding or subtracting computing resources as demand for those resources grows and subsequently ebbs. And then we surround it with a number of monitoring services that allow us to watch what's happening inside of that account and monitor that for potential security risks or violations. The key is that we always deploy accounts in the same way. These are highly tested, highly vetted. All of the configurations are mapped to standard compliance requirements. And in this way, we know that we're not going to have any deviations or one-offs that might inadvertently expose PHI to the public. The next thing we do is we configure in a highly standardized way through services. So on the cloud, we use things like standard images to deploy computing resources. These images are hardened according to military grade security requirements. We deploy them to our customers in a self-service capacity through a service catalog. We use standardized deployment templates with an AWS service called CloudFormation. We manage computing and data resources in a standardized way with Systems Manager. So again, there's no one-off, there's no unique configuration for this one client that might present a unique security challenge. Everything is done through standardization that are specified by the requirements in the compliance framework that is in use. In our case, again, it's HITRUST. When we deploy software or our clients deploy software, that's always done through automated and standardized services. So rather than manually copy files and that sort of thing, we build highly standardized but highly complex deployment solutions that use automated tools so that people aren't in there copying files, but automation is actually executing the deployments. All of this gets wrapped up into a unified view, and so I'm going to show you what we call our compliance dashboard. We have our software go out and collect a tremendous amount of information about what's going on inside of our clients' cloud accounts. And then we identify and visualize all of these findings on an ongoing basis, each one mapped to a level of severity, mapped to the affected service, and then further mapped to the HIPAA CFRs that are associated with that. And so at any given time, you know exactly what your compliance and your security framework looks like, what your standpoint looks like, and whether or not you're in compliance. And if you're out of compliance, the potential risk to the organization and the specific federal regulations that you might be out of compliance with. Let's talk a bit about automation. One of the things that we find is critical, especially if you're in a programmable infrastructure environment like the cloud, is that automating everything reduces risk, and it reduces security risk and therefore helps with compliance. So at Cloudticity, we have a saying that we value silicon over carbon. So human beings are carbon-based life forms. Carbon is great for thinking out of the box, for coming up with creative solutions, but carbon is not good for things that are automated. The problem with carbon, the problem with putting fingers on a keyboard, is that at some point you're going to make a mistake. And many security violations, many HIPAA breaches are the result of simple human error. Silicon, on the other hand, is what makes up computers. And silicon doesn't make a mistake. When you program a computer to do something, it does that thing reliably time and time again. And so when we execute on building secure compliance postures for our clients, we focus on automating everything and making sure that the opportunity for a human to make a mistake and therefore inadvertently introduce risk into the environment is minimized. So one of the ways that we do that, for example, is even when we create an account. We talked about the fact that accounts are created in a very standardized manner, and that is not even done by a human. So when even though we have a runbook and a definition of exactly how accounts should be configured, that's done with full automation. And so everything from creating the account to getting its status, to configuring it, to installing logging, to making sure that the logs are tamper-proof, all of that is done through automation. And what we find is that automated systems have a tremendous benefit over anything that's done manually. It's done predictably, it's done reliably, you have full audit trails, you've pre-mapped all of the steps to required security controls and compliance controls, which are further mapped back to the actual federal regulations that have to be followed. Logs become tamper-proof, and so anybody that inadvertently gains access to the system is not able to cover their footprints or cover their tracks by modifying logs. So the fact that we've fully automated all of the compliance steps and the security steps right from the start prevents errors, which prevents breaches. And in the 10 years that Cloudticity has been in business, with about 100 million lives PHI under our stewardship, dozens and dozens of clients through the years, no system under our management has ever experienced a breach. And we credit that in large part to the focus on compliance frameworks backed by explicit security steps and best practices that are continuously monitored, continuously measured, continuously visualized, and anything that has to be done in that account, whether it's a risk mitigation, a security mitigation, a deployment of a new system, all of that is done through automation as opposed to through humans executing workflow. And the result is a highly compliant, highly secure system that not only meets regulations, but most importantly, reduces the risk of exposure to the types of breaches that tend to put companies out of business. So
we have our first question.
Yeah, perfect. Let's jump in.
Yep. So Marty has asked, is all data or PHI encrypted since it is an addressable implementation specification under HIPAA?
Absolutely. We have, I believe at this point, I think our last high trust attestation was 650 controls, 205 of which our clients can inherit directly. And several of those are related to encryption. And so we require encryption in transit and encryption at rest. We have automations that prevent the inadvertent creation of data storage mechanisms that would be unencrypted. We go a bit further. We look for things like common indicators that the application might be managing unencrypted data. So for example, if we see port 80 open on a load balancer, port 80 is generally unencrypted HTTP traffic. Port 443 would indicate encrypted traffic. And so that would be flagged automatically, and that's a vector for analysis. So we also look for potential unencrypted PHI in transit. So we look for things like database connections that don't require TLS encryption, because sometimes the application will talk to the database unencrypted, not recognizing that under the covers, you're actually sending unencrypted PHI over the wire in transit. Encryption requires a little bit more thought as well. We go a bit further. Encryption is useless, for example, if the keys are compromised or if unauthorized people have access to the keys. You may as well not encrypt. So other things that we check are who has access to encryption keys, and what's the age of those keys, how often are they rotated. We look for unauthorized access attempts, not just at the data, but also unauthorized access attempts at retrieving the keys. So the short answer is yes. In a Cloudticity managed environment, all PHI will automatically be encrypted both in transit and at rest. And we go a bit further to ensure that the mechanisms of encryption, the key management, the access management, and the logging are all up to snuff as well. That's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions coming in. So the next question is, we are a small community hospital with 180 or so beds. We have recently transitioned to what we thought was the cloud with SharePoint and Microsoft 360. If we wanted to move more into the cloud, what would your first step be? So I'm guessing what their first step would be is how that question should be. Yeah,
it's a great question. So SharePoint and Office 365 are cloud environments. That is more, there are multiple types of cloud deployments. There's software as a service. So it used to be, for example, that you might run Word locally on your laptop or desktop. You might run SharePoint or Microsoft Exchange for email on servers in your data center. With Office 365, Microsoft has extrapolated that onto a cloud environment that they manage for you. And so that software that you used to have to run either on your own computer or on your data center's servers is now run on your behalf inside of a data center that Microsoft manages. And that's a great first step into the cloud. So getting rid of commodity tools like email, like document management and document sharing, that's a great first step. The next step into cloud is platform as a service, which is allows programmable things like databases and that sort of thing to be executed not on your servers, but in the cloud. And then the third level is infrastructure as a service, where you can actually create the equivalent of computers, virtual machines or instances, storage that is no longer on disks that are in your data center, but are instead on disks that are in a data center managed by one of the large cloud providers. The general pattern that we see in moving to the cloud tends to start with a financial inflection point and generates advantages that I'll address in a moment. Typical financial inflection points we see are where either your data center lease or your colo lease is about to expire. And that's a great time to think about, should I re-up for another 3 years, or should we think about moving these workloads to a cloud environment? Sometimes companies run out of backup space or storage space, or their servers reach end of life. They're fully depreciated and no longer supported. Those financial inflection points are great opportunities to begin exploring moves to the cloud. In almost all cases, we see financial drivers being the initial driver to move to the cloud. And almost invariably, 3 months after the migration to the cloud, the financial aspect pales in comparison to the increase in agility that the cloud offers. So if I deploy something into my data center, that typically involves, I've got to go fill out some procurement forms, and then I've got to buy a bunch of servers, and then I've got to wait, a month or two for those servers to be delivered, and I've got to unload the boxes at the loading dock, and I've got to unbox the servers and put them in racks and test them, burn them in and configure them and patch them into the network. And that's a long process. It's generally months long. Conversely, if I want to spin up some new infrastructure in the cloud, I press a couple of keys and it's just there. So one of our clients, one of my favorite quotes, the chief solutions officer for one of our clients said, "With Cloudticity, things that used to take me months now only take moments." And what we find is that our clients are able to not only execute more quickly on initiatives that would in the past have required a very long hardware purchase, but they can experiment because you're not buying the server. You don't have to spend $1 million buying a new rack of servers. You can spin up 1,000 servers in seconds, try something out and shut them all down, and you're only paying like per minute. And so you can build a $5 million supercomputer ephemerally for $100. And so the ability not only to create infrastructure quickly, but to try something and then shut it all down and only have to pay for that brief period of time when it was running, allows our clients to try things that they normally would never be able to try. And so that level of agility tends to become a greater driver of cloud adoption over time. So for that question, if you have equipment that's reaching end of life, if you've got a data center that might be expiring on the lease, those are good options. Or if you have new things that you want to try out, you've got an idea, you want to think about ways to use machine learning against images, for example. The cloud is a great place to try those crazy experiments at very low risk and very low cost.
Awesome. So we have a couple more questions. So the next question is, how do you deal with changes for clients who have a unique need that doesn't apply to the rest of your clients? How do you accomplish that through automation?
So good question. Every client has to meet a certain baseline configuration. So for example, We always have a combination of public and private subnets, and things that should not be seen by the outside world only exist on private subnets that have private IP addresses, no routes that connect them to the internet. So there's a baseline configuration that cannot be deviated from. That being said, once you start getting into the specific sets of servers that are deployed or database requirements or application requirements, each client is unique. We work with our clients to create deployable templates that creates that infrastructure. So we'll never go into, for example, the AWS Management Console, which is a web-based console where you can provision infrastructure and create servers and that sort of thing. We never go into that and manually click around to do things. We'll build a CloudFormation template and we'll write some code that will, once the infrastructure is stood up, then you have to install software on it and configure it a certain way. Again, we don't do that manually, we do that through automation. So for clients that have, and over a decade, we've built up a library of common things. So if you need a RabbitMQ cluster or something along those lines, a MongoDB cluster, a Cassandra cluster, we have a library that we can draw from. And if you have a unique need, we'll work with you and build that out. But again, what we're building is the automation to deploy it, not the actual end state. We have a saying at Cloudticity, we don't solve customer problems. We write software that solves customer problems.
Very good. So a couple more questions. So if the task like account creation are done automatically, are humans needed to review the monitoring of the various tools used? Or is that also automated to almost a lights out capability?
We are almost at lights out capability. That's a great question. There are lots of monitoring tools out there, but we took it a step further and we said, what if the problem that gets surfaced, typically there's a dashboard and a human notices that there's a problem and goes and fixes it. What if we said, what if software were able to do that? So on any given day, somewhere between 98 and 99% of our help desk traffic is never touched by a human. So if we identify that a client manually deployed an unencrypted storage mechanism, our software will automatically go and enable encryption and make sure that everything is encrypted. So we really focus on auto remediation. The managed services business traditionally has been very headcount bound. Because you're dealing with physical infrastructure, you need humans to put those servers in or to go investigate if you have a bad network cable or a bad hard drive, right? So the typical managed services business, the constraint is humans. And you need a lot of people staring at screens, putting fingers on keyboards. Because when we started Cloudticity, we were cloud native from day one. We looked at the managed services business not as a human problem, but as a software problem. And so we were very intentional from day one about automating humans out of the equation to the maximum extent possible. So what humans do at Cloudticity is not go fix disk space problems. We think about a much higher order. And so we're able to help our clients evolve their business or think of new ways to leverage technology to achieve their mission, whether it's helping a patient in a bed or whether it's building a care management solution or a better way to diagnose images. We think that humans are really good at things like that. And so we let computers do things that they're good at, which includes the vast majority of risk mitigation and problem remediation.
Awesome. Okay, so the question that was just chatted to me privately, I will get to in just a second, because this question ties more closely to what we were just talking about, which is how would you validate that the request for the account creation was a legitimate request? So that's the integrity.
So that is something that a human does. So, there's two pieces to it. So a new account creation is something that we will trigger. And so the request comes to us and a human triggers the account creation. And with each of our clients, we have a validation, an agreed upon set of validations. And so it has to come from a certain person, and we have a way of validating that it really came from that person. So the trigger, let's push the button to start the account creation process, that happens with a human validation. Once the account is created, we give customers the ability to self-provision within that account. So if they want to take a piece of infrastructure off of our library, off the shelf of our library, so if they want to deploy a new MongoDB cluster, they use a service in AWS, Amazon Web Services, called the Service Catalog. And that allows authorized users to deploy things that they are authorized to deploy. And so they have to authenticate, and we require advanced authentication mechanisms like multi-factor authentication. And then they have to have been explicitly granted access to deploy the thing that they want to deploy. And when they deploy it, it's deployed using an atomic pre-vetted configuration that they don't have, other than the ability to enter certain parameters, like do you need a small, medium, large kind of thing. They don't have the ability to alter anything outside of pre-allowed parameters. So initial account creation is vetted by a human, and subsequent use of that account is done through authorization and authentication and authorization that provides access to pre-vetted components. So we think it's sort of the best of both worlds in that you don't have to go through your MSP. You don't have to go to Cloudticity to do a lot of things that you would normally have to have your MSP do on your behalf. But you do have sort of that bubble wrapping of safety by only having authenticated and authorized access to a certain set of pre-existing and highly vetted components.
Perfect. Thank you. So the other question is, we are a medium-sized health system. I'm the IT director. Mm-hmm. We have started to utilize automation tools for privacy compliance as well as through our process management. If we wanted to start managing our security compliance more in the cloud and automating that, what would our first step be? We are not in the cloud yet. We have a series of servers in our basement.
Well, I'd love to say your first step would be to call Cloudticity, but that would be a bit self-serving. So it's a good question. You remember earlier in the webinar, we talked about frameworks. So, again, the topic of this series is security over compliance. Compliance is an end state, but the real important thing is the steps that you take to get to compliance. And it's those standardized security steps. So the very first thing that I would do is to identify the security framework that you want to follow. And that can be something that's out in the wild, like HITRUST. That can be something homegrown by your organization's compliance or security departments. But it comes down to individual executable, actionable, monitorable controls. So for example, a common security control is around password complexity. And so you would write automation, you would write code that iterates through everybody's account and checks that their password is compliant with your password complexity requirements. Even more preferable, you'd have automation that configures the directory to not even allow somebody to create a non-compliant password. So most identity providers like AD, or IAM inside of AWS offer the ability to specify password requirements, which we would advocate that you enable that configuration not manually but through code. And that you have code that on a periodic basis monitors again to make sure that those settings haven't been changed. Encryption requirements, you can, once you've specified your measurable encryption requirements, you can write code that says, okay, we're going to monitor for common ports used for unencrypted data exchange. We're going to use machine learning on our network traffic to identify common patterns of unencrypted data. We're going to look at all storage configuration to make sure that automated encryption is enabled in all possible places. We're going to use automation to look at our key management tools, whether it's an HSM or whether it's virtual, but to identify, build rule sets around appropriate key rotation policies, key access policies, logging of both successful and unsuccessful key accesses, automated monitoring of those logs. All of these things can be done in software, but you first have to define the security policies that you want to implement, and that generally is based on the compliance framework mapped to whatever regulations you need to follow. In our case, it's going to be HIPAA. And then either build or buy software that implements those policies using automation. I hope that's helpful.
Awesome. Thank you, Jerry. So we have one last question, and we'll see if anybody else asks more.
Sure.
So we recently conducted our security risk analysis. The risk analysis was triggered because we had 30 security incidents that we investigated last year. Our security rating was a 3 out of 5. So we feel like we're not doing all that great. We feel like we may have the right expertise in the right places. However, we still can't get a handle on how to manage our security in-house. Would you recommend outsourcing our compliance? We are a small hospital. Or would you recommend that we train folks internally and start to utilize more automated processes in the cloud, as you were saying? This is a trick question, I think, Jerry.
Those are not mutually exclusive solutions, I think. I would highly recommend the second piece, no matter what. We find that cloud is almost always more secure than on-prem. The large cloud providers have millions of active customers. They've been doing this for a very long time. They've got a lot of practice, and they're really good at security. When we started this company in 2011, AWS wouldn't even sign a BAA. So, cloud was still this mysterious thing. There was no BAA even available. Can you imagine me going to a hospital and being like, hey, you should do this crazy thing? And we did. We had some early adopters that bought in. But today, there's a widespread understanding that your data are significantly safer in a public cloud than they would be on-prem. Now, if you mismanage that public cloud deployment, if you put it in this public place that anybody in the world can access, and that happens, that's not a failure of the cloud. That's a failure of your management of your cloud environment. But a well-managed cloud environment will invariably be more secure than a well-managed on-prem environment. So I would absolutely recommend, no matter what, cloud or not, automate. You're much, much less likely to have a breach when you have full automation, or even partial automation is better than nothing, because there's no opportunity to make mistakes. It's fully monitorable. It's fully auditable. So automate first, preferably use cloud. And whether you choose to do that in-house or whether you choose to leverage a partner is an organizational decision.
Right. I also think that it's going to depend a lot on what the vulnerabilities and threats were that got you that 3 rating.
Right.
Because I know that seems like, oh, that's a C, 3 out of 5, it's right dab in the middle, but that's actually really scary to have a 3 out of 5 rating, especially if you had 30 incidents last year. So I think one of the things you need to evaluate is what type of security incidents were those, and how can you start to automate those, and then look and see what Jerry was talking about and see if those are things that can be automated in the cloud, or whether those are things that you need to address like outside, like were they security incidents because somebody clicked in a phishing email, in which case you need to look at that, so evaluating where those risks really are. And I know there are a couple people on the call right now that do security risk analyses frequently and can talk about how to look at what your identified risks are, and then evaluate what your next steps should be and how you can kind of automate your compliance moving forward to bump that security rating up. So some of those folks that specialize in doing the risk assessments all the time, go ahead and feel free to speak up. That's something that I think is really key. And I think, and Jerry, I think you would agree with me too, is before you do anything, you have to conduct the security risk analysis. So the fact that you've already done that and you have that standpoint, that's the first step into moving into any sort of automation to help protect yourself.
Always. Yeah. You need a framework which defines tangible, measurable steps and maps them back to your fundamental requirements from a compliance and a risk perspective. And then you need to know where you're strong and where you're not. Most breaches are not technical breaches. Most breaches are people breaches. It's, we just did last week at Cloudticity, we do we call them secret shopper tests, where I hire an outside company to conduct a phishing campaign by email, or to call, the folks on our team and pretend to be Blue Cross, which is our insurance carrier, and, see if they can social engineer some information out of them. And, we fare quite well on those, and every once in a while we'll come up with, a vector that is successful, and that's a great opportunity for us to update our training. So, security is not, and risk mitigation and vulnerability assessment is not just like, are my data encrypted, but, are my people trained enough to identify a phishing email where they're not going to inadvertently give up, some keys to the kingdom. So much of it is technical validation that can be automated, and some of it is process validation that, in many cases can't be fully automated, but needs to be supplemented with strong monitoring and strong training.
Very good. I think, Murat, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jerry. I really liked it. Very succinct presentation.
Thank you.
Obviously, the issue around threats, type of threats, how many threats a day, an hour, a minute.
Mm-hmm.
What are the metrics more for you that you've seen, and how are they different? Pre-COVID to post-COVID,
Yep.
and are some of these threats, immediate synchronous threats, or are they worms that are going to come alive on Christmas Eve when everybody's not looking? How do you see all of that developing right now?
So we're seeing a massive uptick in attacks based on COVID. We are also seeing a significant uptick in attacks on companies like Cloudticity, because we are a healthcare specific MSP. If one of our client systems gets breached, that's just their system that gets breached. If our systems get breached, that's a potential vector into all of our clients. And so MSPs are becoming a desired target. So we're seeing an uptick in social engineering, text message-based attacks, email phishing, phone calls, technical attacks. Like, our AWS presence is constantly under attack. So we use a wide variety of tools. We use a lot of machine learning to analyze network traffic in real time, and we subscribe to many external threat databases so that we're always up to date on, what's the latest threats. It's a big cat and mouse game. The attackers are getting significantly more sophisticated. It's much more state-sponsored attacks now than, the sort of the script kiddie attacks of days past. So we monitor a lot of inbound in that sort of thing. The wide proliferation of open source is opening a new attack vector. So, everybody is using package managers. If you're a Node.js development shop, you're using NPM, et cetera. So we're seeing attempts to install malware in common packages that are in use in software. And so, we're subscribing to services that map that out. We also see, mistakes. I mean, we saw a guy, a client of ours, one of the guys manually installed a piece of software that contained a Bitcoin mining piece of malware. So, fortunately it was benign. It was just stealing his processor cycles for Bitcoin mining, not, stealing their PHI. But we caught that because we're not only monitoring inbound traffic, we're monitoring outbound traffic. And our machine learning algorithms caught unexpected connections to global servers that are well-known endpoints to deposit Bitcoin mining data. So, the attack vectors come from all angles, and you need to use defense in depth. So you need to monitor network traffic, both inbound and outbound. You need to monitor traffic within your network. So server to server or server to database connectivity. And then you need to monitor what's going on in your code to identify potential placement of malicious packages that might be dormant, so you wouldn't catch them in action until it's too late. And you need to monitor your account configuration. Sometimes all a malicious thing will do is enable a policy that a piece of storage is now publicly accessible. And so we watch for unexpected changes in configuration. We use machine learning algorithms to identify, we have a tolerance band. We know that every day a client does a certain number of things, and if one day they do something that is anomalous, we'll catch that. And so the types of threats that we see evolve, the location or the source of those threats evolves. And, we need to evolve on a daily basis to keep up with that. That's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So another question came in. So when we're talking about monitoring, we are evaluating several systems to adopt to monitor our data security as well as privacy. Mm-hmm. One of the companies that we are looking at is called Maze Analytics. Have you heard of them, and what do you think?
I've not heard of them, so I'm sorry, I can't comment.
That's fair enough. All right, so are there any other questions? All right, perfect. Thank you everybody so much for participating today. You will receive a copy of this recording probably by the end of the day today, at the latest tomorrow morning. Look forward to the next presentation next week, which is on data governance and the role of your board. So be sure to join us next week for that conversation with Management Performance Associates Scott Gima. So thank you again for everybody who participated, and a huge thank you to Jerry Miller for taking time out on your vacation to present to all of us. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. I appreciate the time, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Sarah. And this is Kate from Cogticity. Just wanted to let you guys know, if you want to learn more about the use of AI ops and automation to help protect your cloud workloads, go to cogticity.com/AIOps.
Perfect. We will also be sharing Jerry's contact information when we send out the recording. So feel free to reach out to Jerry, who is a great resource for all things cloud-based and security.
Thank you very much. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.